All right, get thumbs up. Wow, new faces. So many new people here. You came because you love pizza, right? Did any of you come because you love animation? Yes! Woo! Okay, I got to do a head count though. I'm curious to know how many of you are designers? Raise your little hands. How many of you are developers? How many of you are front end developers specifically? UX, UXers? Animators? Oh, thank you for coming out. And how many of you are some Venn diagram of those? Woo! Yes, it's lovely being unicorns. We can toss our rainbow manes upstairs later. Okay, so I love animation. I'm specifically though, I love it both for its utility and for its beauty, which sometimes puts me at a conflict. But before I talk about that, I'm curious, how many of you think animation is a useful thing? You know, you want to put it to work. And how many of you are like, animation's just pretty? I want to learn how to make things prettier with animation. Okay, good, good. This is the right audience. So yes, I'm Rachel Nabors, and before I was a web animation wonk, before I was even in web development, I was an award-winning cartoonist. I was a storyteller. I made comics for a website that was frequented by teenage girls, and every week 400,000 young women from around the world would read one of my comics, and they all thought I was so cool. This was back before there was even a word for social media. This was back in 2006. So I made sites mainly to publish and promote my work, and it was sort of like I was using the golden goose to make omelets. I was like, oh, look at these pretty eggs. Yeah, make them some omelets. Just toss the eggs out. I didn't realize that people would pay me so much more to do the web development that I was doing to promote the thing that I love. But I was going to find out because life happened. It turned out that I needed to get some major jaw surgery, and cartoonists, this was back before Obamacare, did not have health insurance. So I had to look at my skills and say, well, what can I do to get my hands on some surgery? And I changed my entire life. I took the golden goose to market and I was like, all right, now you're paying for the eggs. And I ended up getting into web development. But little did I know that 5 years later, my comic skills would translate into something very useful, storyboarding specifically. My front end development skills translated into CSS animations, and I thought, animation, storyboards, I can code the things in my head, and now I can animate them, and I don't have to worry about learning Flash because the JavaScript I learned is applicable. I'm going to do this full time. So boom, quit the job, started traveling the world and just studying animation full time, web animation specifically. It's a lot different from the days of Flash. Now you'll see things like this cropping up. Um, good, good, good. The videos are working. Uh, this is Google Material Design's guidelines. They feature motion design very prominently. This was the first time a lot of front-end developers and even web designers might have heard of motion design. And when I saw this, I was like, yes, vindication, it's back. Animation can come back to the web in a big way, in a responsible way. Now you'll see that animation's kind of taken off. They're pretty much any big company that releases style guides or design guides is going to have a motion section. Unfortunately, the United States government just released theirs, but they don't have a motion section, which kind of shows you where motion is on most people's priority list. So let's see, we've got IBM, we got Google, we've got Salesforce. I actually had my hand in Salesforce's Lightning design system. I helped them with their motion design section. Like I said, it's showing up in big ways in people's style guides and design systems. Definitely animation has returned to our tool sets as a powerful way to stand out from the competition. I mean, Amazon doesn't have a style guide or a design system with a motion section. No, maybe Walmart can one-up them with one. It seems right now, I feel like motion is this sort of one-upmanship going on with various designers trying to show off the capacities of their teams to one another. But I assure you, there's a very good reason for this. But first, before we talk more about that, what have we learned since the rise of UX, user experience design, that can help us not abuse it? This is some top-notch Flash animation. Back when I made comics for a living, this was the kind of website I aspired to one day build. I remember I had little piles of Flash animation books that I was like, I'm going to go read them. I'm going to read them one day when I'm not meeting deadlines. I never got around to it. I was working with my CSS files at my first little web design agency job, and I was like, I'm going to learn it one day. I'm going to learn it one day, and then Flash died. So I was like, no, JavaScript. So let's get into how people's brains work. This is a fun thing about animation. You can't study animation without studying how people's brains work with it. Otherwise, it really is just prettiness. So this is a commonplace animation. It's a drop down, right? You hover, you click, information appears beneath it. We use this all the time. My thanks to CoDrops for letting me borrow theirs. Specifically, this is what we call a jump cut. It's from film. It's a term. The old web, the web that didn't use Flash, ran on jump cuts. We see jump cuts all the time in film, on TV. This is playing, but you'll notice that the camera jumps from her face to his face. There's no transition, there's no fade, there's no zoom in. It's just cut, cut, cut. You'll also notice that the camera is following the actor's eyes. I'm going to back up and show this one to you one more time because we don't have the benefit of these indicators. Notice that his face looks off to her, and then the camera jump cuts to her. So the people who are watching this are not confused spatially. There are these subtle clues that the directors are using to make sure that the people, their users essentially, aren't getting disoriented while they're watching this. And they have decades and decades and decades of research and practice behind cinematography. They're so lucky. Unfortunately, user interfaces are not human faces, and people have a much more difficult time reorienting after jump cuts between states and software and on websites. When a person sees this, they have to make a lot of assumptions. Now, fortunately, the human mind is usually clever enough that it can take a before image and an after image and kind of extrapolate between those two states, figure out what happened there. We have another term for this, also from the land of theaters. In animation, we call this in-betweening. This is basically when you take, you know what, my pointer's not working so great here, so I'll use my hands. You take one drawing, and you take this other drawing, and some poor schlub has to draw every in-between state from one to the other. Now, this seems exciting upon first glance, but let me remind you that when people go to animation school, this is what they spend their first or second semester on, and by the time they're done with it, they're absolutely sick of it, and they totally understand why people outsource everything to countries where the dollar can buy you so many more man hours, because it is an utter boring waste of time. You want to be the person who draws this cool picture or that cool picture, but not the cool pictures in between. That's in-betweening, and it's a dead-end job. Only interns do in-betweening. So, unfortunately, brains don't like doing it either, especially with old and young people, babies and older folks whose brains aren't in their mental prime. You might find that they say, "What just happened?" a lot, or act confused. That's because in-betweening is mental busy work. It takes a lot of effort, and it doesn't have a lot of payoff. So we're all in our mental prime. We don't see an issue between an open and a close like that. There's no problem with that, right? That's fine. You can ship that. It's no problem. But if you were making an app to be used by third graders, or made by somebody who's over 60, or someone who doesn't use a flipping iPad every day, you might hear more, "What just happened?" and "I'm confused" coming from those users, or even from little kids, "I'm bored." That's because people in our mental prime, like you and I, because we work on these computers all days, We are just so primed for doing this kind of mental busy work. We don't notice the increase in cognitive load. There was back in 1990, the early 1990s, there was a lot of really interesting work done with animation and user interfaces. It was interesting because a lot of papers came out about it. There's some really good stuff in there. I've learned that you can put an iPad into a Ziploc bag and you can sit in the bathtub and read them all on PDF. That's very good. You'll need a lot of bathtubs and a lot of bathtub salt. But anyway, that was back in the early 90s. You'll notice that there is like a brief flurry of papers on animation and UIs, and then there's nothing. This is around the time that Apple and Microsoft started releasing operating systems that featured animation. You can kind of guess that the people who were doing the most research probably got hired, and then all their work became classified. So we don't have access to whatever goodies that they went on to discover. Yay. So basically, what this little snippet here from one of my favorite papers from Scott E. Hudson and John T. Stashko, basically all it says is that you can use animation to speed up mental processing by offloading interpretation from the brain to the visual cortex, thus freeing up people to continue thinking about whatever it is they're supposed to be thinking about while they're interacting with your system, not trying to figure out what the system's trying to tell them. I like to neaten this with a little picture here. I like to say that the visual cortex works like your brain's GPU. You can use it, it's a dedicated processing unit just for graphics, for visual input. And if you use animation as a shortcut through the brain's GPU, essentially, the rest of the machine can get on doing what it needs to do on the main thread. Now, nowhere was this more apparent than when touch came to handheld devices. One of the reasons when these things came out, we heard so many, even my grandpa can use it. And look, it's a video of my toddler using my phone. It's got to be so awesome. This thing's built to be so intuitive. It's funny because once you understand how touch and animation are necessary for the pictures under glass metaphor to work, the parlor trick becomes quite obvious. Causation and change are tightly coupled with animation. When you have people using a mouse, there's a certain expectation of delay, a certain distance between them and their interaction. But when it's their hand, you can't use jump cuts. Many other companies had tried to do touch with visual and touch graphics before. Many other companies had tried to do touch on handheld devices before, and it didn't quite work out. Part of that was probably because they were not focusing on using animation to link causation as much as they should have. They were still working with that horrible jump cut model that we've gotten used to using on the web, and it just does not translate to small spaces. So anyway, this is much better. In the end, what research tells us is that by animating the transition between two states, the viewer's visual cortex will handle the change without interrupting their thought process. And when people are on tiny devices with lots of things happening around them and on the screen, that makes a really big difference. All right, here's the part where usually I end up getting into arguments with performance wonks over drinks. Is there anyone here who's a really high on performance? Like, this is your thing. You love it. Yeah, I love you. I love you so much. I do. I do. But let's not get these things conflated. I hear this. I've gone into companies and you come in and you're like, well, we could add a 200 millisecond animation to this. It would be a lot smoother for the user. And rightly so. Someone who just spent several weekends shaving 200 milliseconds off of a load process is going to bustle right up and be like, that's going to ruin the user's experience, Rachel. How dare you say that we make it slower? Slower? It's okay. I like to say, let's consider the cognitive load cost here. There is a cognitive load boost you get by using that visual cortex hidden pathway. This is a completely fake chart. I only make this chart to help. There's a way you can get numbers. I'll give you the thing to Google so that you can do your own math. We're not going to do the math. I don't have the time to show you the math. It's a lot of fun if you like math, but it's a whole talk in its own. But just keep in mind, fake information for display purposes only. Do not show this to your boss. So imagine you have 2 pages. You have a jump cut site that's been super performantly optimized and it loads in 2 seconds. I don't know what you got on there, some really gigantic pictures or something. One takes 2 seconds to load, and the other one has an animation library on it. And oh, green sock, the first time people see that thing and it's not in a CDN, it's going to take an extra second to load it. Oh, these connection speeds, so sad. So you got a jump cut site that takes 2 seconds to load, and an animated site, because of its extra library, which you didn't have to use, but they decided to use it, it takes 3 seconds to load. This is all hypothetical. These load times would not look anything like that on a regular site. All right. So at first, the animated site's going to look slower. You think, well, that's going to be sad. The user's going to take an extra second. That's going to translate to like hundreds of millions of dollars for Amazon. Your site is probably not Amazon, so I don't know how that metaphor translates to the business you're doing. But okay, let's say that you've sold your boss on that every second costs us hundreds of millions of dollars metaphor. Now, let's factor in some cognitive load here. On the jump cut site, it might take some of your users 3 seconds to orient between loading, say, a product page and a buying page, going from one information space to reorienting in a whole new one. The animated site, though, you've reduced that reorientation to about half a second. In that case, the perceived speed of the animated site will be less than the jump cut site. This is just trying to show you some things visually. Don't use these numbers. In production, your numbers are going to be different. But this can give you an idea of how reorientation for some users is a bigger hit even than page load times. And it can make the site seem laggy when it's not. It might be the most performant thing in the world, but if the information isn't getting through the person's visual cortex correctly, it will still be hard for them. And it will feel lower. So now you're saying, okay, Rachel, I want to make one of those charts. I want to show it to my boss. How do I do that? You're going to have to do your own math. Google KLM GOMS. I even brought a little sheet with me if you want to look at it at the bar later. It lets you tally up all the different things that the user is going to do. And once again, these are also hypothetical things, but they're hypothetical things out of brave and valiant research institutions that have been made off of measuring many different people's response times and giving you medians. But anyway, you can actually tally up how long each interaction takes, and then you can see if you can make any big wins in your animation space. Lovely, I love it. Talk to me more about that afterward. All right. So in addition to showing causation and linking states, animation can also, of course, be used to capture attention. We have even more prestigious research that shows that humans are suckers for movement. I mean, it makes sense. We evolved from creatures that lived on plains. We were prey species. We were also hunter species. So actually paying attention to the world around us, seeing something move in their peripheral vision could be the difference between being someone else's lunch or bringing a tasty meal back for the fam. There's this wonderful word that doesn't exist. It's called animacy. And I'm not the one who made it. It's actually from that research paper before. So, proper credit. Basically, animacy is how alive and thus attention-grabbing something appears to be. Human attention, for instance, can be immediately grabbed by 2 things, color and movement. You've heard if you want someone to notice something, you make it big and bright and jiggly, right? We have, well, it doesn't show, but it's jiggling all over the place right now. Of course, this can and has been abused. I don't know why this pattern died. Oh wait, ad block. It's always an arms race. So we can stop ourselves from being abusive by being mindful of the user's cone of vision. Here's the part where I get to ramble a little bit longer. So people's eyes, I'm gonna just totally level this out, but here's generally how it works. we sense a lot of color in the middle part of in the center of our vision. This might be why if you've ever been staring at something for a very long period of time, you'll notice that everything outside, immediately what you're staring at kind of grays out and turns to static. And then you look around the room. I think it's called saccade movement. It's when your eyes dart from thing to thing. Your eyes are constantly doing it. It's a subconscious motion, but what your brain is doing is playing paint by number. It's taking a mental note of where everything is in the room. It's got this image inside. You're not actually seeing full color. You're only seeing full color right here. Your brain is painting all this area constantly based on those movements. If colors change outside the center of your vision, you're not likely to notice it because your brain's working on outdated information. Unless your eyes go to where the color has changed, you're not likely to notice it. That said, we are quite good at picking out movement from our peripheral vision. So it follows that simply use color and opacity to be discrete in the center of someone's vision. If you want to animate something in the center of a page, if you're certain that people are going to be looking in one specific location, you probably want to do something delicate and soft with some color or some opacity. You don't want to be like boing, 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 because that would be bad. We learned that. We learned that in the past. However, if you want to tell someone that their house is on fire, but that's going to be in a sidebar, or that's going to be towards the bottom of the phone, you might want to bounce that a bit, just to be like, hi, very polite little notification here, your house is on fire. But you're going to have to draw a little bit of attention to it with some bounce. Remember, don't use these in dark patterns. I'm only telling you these things because I'd like to believe we're all adults, and we all went through the time without flash and learned our lessons in the corner, so you're not going to do anything bad with the information I've given you. Or I'm going to have to come to your house and, yes. We do collect addresses when they sign up, right? So, now keep in mind, motion and opacity are to animation what font sizes and weight are to typography. That is to say, you don't want to go in and make everything 48 pixels big and bold and italic and blinking. When everything vies for our attention, nothing gets attention. We simply don't know what to focus on, and it becomes a bunch of visual noise and often increases people's anxieties. So how does this all apply to our designs? Here's the part where you get to take things home with you. Not physical things, knowledge. So I'm going to spell this out again because sometimes I'll be reading a book on animation and they'll be like, animation is motion, and then like 5 chapters in they'll go, actually animation's not really motion, it's just a visual representation of a rate of change. It is just a visual representation of a rate of change. Animation, pretty much anything can be animated. You can animate position, you can animate size and opacity, shape even, you can do all kinds of things. Any visual property can be animated. Just a rate of change over time. Kind of like the Doppler effect with sound. It shows you where sound is coming from as it's moving over a period of time. So we can use animation to indicate a change in direction, solidity, momentum, and we can combine these different things to create different effects. And I'm going to go over 4 different effects that I see most often evaluating different people's UI across the board. First off, there are stateful transitions. Now, transitions these are your heavy hitters. These are often your low-hanging fruit. Transitions can guide users between states in a task flow, from page to page, field to field, in a form, from different information spaces, even when going through, well, a document selection. I remember there was a time, maybe it was 2010, where DHTML was a buzzword and everybody wanted sites that didn't refresh when they loaded a new page. And then people just kind of lost track of that. And now we have React and everything, and it's still a big deal. Like, content comes on the page without having to refresh it. Stateful transitions are like totally all about that. And there's a reason they're popular. Although people can't often put their finger on why they like the page to animate in, it's because the content stays where you expect it to stay, and you don't have to do a quick eye movement across the page to make sure you're still in the same structure. So let's have a look at how I've got one on mine. This is my site. And when you go from page to page, you'll notice that there's a little up and down motion. The page doesn't reload, and only one part of the page is changing. There's even a little opacity flash to let you know stuff is changing. There's a little bit of movement, just a little bit. I probably wouldn't do that today. But you know, you're allowed to have a little fun on your own site. Here's someone else's site. So you're looking at shoes, and these are actually the shoes I'm wearing today. And notice how the whole page has changed. You're in a search mode right now. You're not actually in a different space, but you're on a different task. You're searching. And when you hit that particular link, notice there was a total jump cut there. It didn't need to jump cut. That could have totally slid back up. But I would have animated the transition to this page personally. But that's an example of one of those. Here, look, there's another transition. Now we're going from browsing to looking at people's photos. Light boxes often come with transitions. They're kind of like the oatmeal of interaction patterns, and they're super easy to animate. But there you go. This person is doing 3 different tasks. Sorry, this is me. They are visiting the shoes, they're searching for the shoes, and now they're looking at other people's shoes. What the hell did they do to those shoes? Thank you, Fubog. So up next, supplemental animations. Supplemental animation, it doesn't change the whole page. It doesn't take you from one place to another. What it does is it accentuates secondary information to the main topic on the page. Things like alerts, notifications, spoilers, updates. It's also really easy to abuse, so be careful. It can be really easy to be like, I am justifying this animation because it's a secondary animation. It's a supplemental content. Yeah. Be careful. Be very careful. So here's an example of some supplemental animation on my site. Go back. Go back. You gonna do it? There we go. So this is my sidebar, and you can get rid of it because you might not always want that sidebar sticking there. It can be kind of visually distracting because it's so awesome. But as you can see, instead of just boom, it disappears when you click the nixus, it does slide gently out of the way. Here's another example on someone else's site. It can't all be me. But you'll notice that when people hover over each of these titles, a little description floats up from the bottom. This is actually a really interesting way of anticipation here, because I'll go back. I want to keep doing that. So this is an interesting example of anticipation, because if someone's hovering over a title, you can assume that they're thinking about clicking. If you offer them a little bit more information about what it links to, maybe they will go ahead and click. That's pretty good use of some supplemental animation there, because you want people to just see a list of titles. You don't want them getting bogged down in taglines too. It's visually cluttered. Now notice when they're reading, as they scroll further down, once again, we're going to make an assumption on this site. If they've gotten all the way down to the bottom of the page, they probably really enjoyed this article because they're still reading, right? So maybe then it's a good time to gently introduce an option to share. It moves a little. It's much less likely to be screened out by their visual cortex if you just put some links to Twitter and stuff at the bottom down there. By having it pop up gently, you're just kind of, hi, you got this far, you might want to tell your friends. Personally, I never use those links, but I thought this was a nice and not so obvious or sad way of doing it. Then there's causal animation, or causal effects. When you want to indicate that something caused something else to happen, loaders, hover effects, these also are, well, they're causal effects. These are pretty darn important, and this is where touch really benefits. We all know this, the hover state. Look, there's one, there's another. When you hover over the button, it depresses. Here are a bunch of them. Let's see if this can hold up with it. So there are a lot of different things here. Notice the big peacock moving around. Notice when you hover over on the different states over there, they highlight. When you click on one, there's a stateful transition. But here specifically, when you're hovering over the male peacock or the female peacock, it's clearly showing you which one of those is going to be selected if you click. And then we've got this lovely little supplemental animation bringing in the, yeah, you got it right. And once again, another selection interaction. Now, can you imagine what this would have been like back in the era of jump cuts? It would have just been like some pictures and like radio buttons and then next page. It would have been very sad. But anyway, I love the things that Cornell Lab does with their different quizzes and interactive things with their birds. You should check out their work, especially if you like learning things about the natural world. Here we go. Decorative animations. Decorative animations are like the sugars and salts of the animation food pyramid. They're right up there at the tippy top. Everybody loves them. Everybody wants to have them at the company picnic. But deep down inside, you know it's wrong. So decorative animation, it adds embellishment, but it doesn't actually increase the information space. Supplemental animations tell you more about the thing you're about to do. State transitions show you where you're going and where you've been. Add even causation effects. They tell you this has caused this thing to happen. You are doing this. But decorative animation, you saw the moving fancy peacock back there. I'm going to show you the fancy peacock again. Come on back, fancy peacock. Because this is a decorative animation, even though it's a video. We don't really need to be seeing him moving around back there. I mean, my God, the data can't even get up there fast enough. But why? I mean, that could have just been a picture. These are just pictures of the birds. Why was he moving? Why was it like that? Why did it have to be that way, fancy peacock? Because somebody said, this looks cool, and everyone is using videos behind stuff right now, and we got to do that too. And also, we should probably do some parallax. I run into this a lot. This is where, whenever I have a client come to me and say, we need your help with animation, and they're a really big company, it's usually because someone up top was like, we need parallax and delight, and animation's going to make that happen. No. Decorative animations don't usually add to the delight of a system, because once again, they don't actually add information back. They're not making it easier to use. They are the thing you will notice and remember, but that's not always a good thing. Let's take a look at some of them. So I slowed this one down. You can't see, yeah, you can see that I in-betweened the text, so it morphs from one to another, and it's so cool. I didn't have to do that. I could have just swapped out the text and been like, boom. But I in-betweened it all myself because I thought it was cool. So this was purely for effect. It's purely decorative. Didn't have to do that. Didn't have to waste the GPU cycles on it, but I did it. But not all decorative animations are bad. Who remembers this article when it came out? I'm guessing somebody. Come on. Yeah, you can still see it. Who read this? Who read this when it came out? You still remember it. I see 2 people remember it, but you remember it. Now, how much less would you remember if that had just been a picture of the Xbox One? This big old chunk of plastic. Yeah, you wouldn't have remembered it at all. So, interesting thing. I remember when this came out, this was the first time anybody had really seen SVG drawing in like that, right? Usually in these reviews of consoles, there are a bunch of, well, they make them as attractive as they can look, pictures of the console, and there's a lot of text. There's a lot of text. And if you really are interested in that console, you'll keep reading. But one looks very much like the other. Now, Polygon wanted to make theirs stand out a little bit. So they made line art of the console and animated it in so that you knew you were reading Polygon's article on the Xbox One. And it looked different from all the other articles. So it really stood out and probably got shared a whole lot more because of that. There was a novelty factor to it, yes. I'm sure if everybody used this technique to draw every console and every article, it wouldn't make a difference. But this is an example of people strategically using decorative animation to get a leg up on their competitors. And I don't know, they may have sold this as being delightful to whoever approved it, or they may have just sold it by saying nobody else will do this, it'll make us look cool. And that would have been the correct response. All right, so in practice, how do we bring all these things together at work? Well, hopefully your process looks something like this. You do a lot of UX and information architecture research in the beginning. You know who your users are going to be. You go out, you interview them, and then you come back and you're making wireframes and storyboards, and then you end up building a prototype, and then you test that prototype on actual users, not your boss, not your wife, not your husband, actual users of your system, and you find all kinds of problems, and you go back and you repeat it till you get about like 80% compliant, and then you ship it. How many people do it that way? It's true. So this is where animation needs to happen. You're going to have a hell of a time if you let animation wait all the way until the end of your process to take it into consideration. There is nothing more depressing than retrofitting animation and finding all the weird quirks of an information architecture system that wasn't quite thought out, or like these two pages are linked to each other and can display a lot of the same information but in completely different places because people weren't considering how that content connected. So retrofitting animation often sounds like, oh, that's so expensive and difficult, precisely because it underlines a lot of the flaws of the thinking that went into the process from the start. So when you're thinking about animation, it's usually a lot easier if you think about it earlier. And you're going to have a lot less pain. You're probably going to build something a little bit more robust for having to think about it earlier. The same way thinking about how something's going to look on different screen sizes early on in design is going to help you build something that looks better on other screens. So about those storyboards, I took this photo myself. It's a Ferdinand the Bull, one of the first storyboards that was ever made, down at the Disney Family Museum in California. Now, Disney Studios invented storyboards to help keep different teams on track for greater vision. Storyboards were specifically, they came out for Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, because prior to Snow White, cartoons were, tell me if this process sounds familiar. There'd be a writer and an artist and maybe some technical person. They get together, they come up with a gag, they do it off on the side, then they meet up with another group just like them who'd done another gag, and they stitch them all together to create about 5 minutes short with people chasing each other around, and it's kind of loosely connected by transitional scenes. But then they all go back and work in their respective caves, and this is how they make cartoons. Sounds a little familiar. So Disney realized there was no way that they could build an entire feature-length animation with everybody going off and working in their own cave and not talking to each other. Characters would be off-model. There weren't going to be any transitional scenes because there's actually going to be a plot, goddammit. And it was a lot of things happened very rapidly. Whole scenes would get cut if they weren't coming up to the right, meeting the budget right. But how are they going to how are they going to convey these things to each other? Storyboards. Every morning, people would get together, they put the scenes down on these big cork boards, like so. And then, after everyone had concurred that yes, this is the way the future film is going to look, they would tote the cork boards off to the respective animation studios where people would work on them from there. And they would do this every day, every week, and everybody could see where everybody else was at any given time. And the piece knitted itself together. It did change, but everyone kept moving in the same direction because they had this unifying storyboard principle. Now everyone uses storyboards. Game design uses storyboards. Film uses storyboards. Yes, the same people who laughed at Disney, they use storyboards now. Thank you, Disney. So storyboards are a big deal, and we even use them in interaction design. We use them in UX to help build stories about how users will use things. They're ridiculously useful. I highly recommend, even if you aren't a designer or you aren't a UXer, give storyboarding a look as a communication tool for your teams to interact with one another better. Okay, storyboards are really helpful for figuring out where animation goes because they help you find your key poses. Now, key poses, remember we talked about in-betweening earlier. Well, key poses are the poses that the actual animators who go to art school want to draw. These are like your wireframes, your mock-ups. This is the product page. This is the search page, etc. Storyboarding helps you find those keys, where those key interactions happen, where those things happen, but usually they have to be knit together by some form of animation, be it a state transition or supplemental animation, or even just causation. to indicate what's causing the other thing to happen. I highly recommend that you look for page loads. Anywhere AJAX form submissions are happening, anytime the page or its content changes. If there's a flash on the screen, is there a way that you could animate that instead of reloading all of that information? Is there a way that you can reduce the number of flashes that are hitting your user's eyeballs? That's the easy way to look for it if you're retrofitting. Now, stateful transitions are going to be useful whenever a user changes tasks or an information domain. Supplemental animations, great when new information appears on or off the screen. And causal effects for whenever a user interacts with a page, or when two elements on a page interact with each other. But before you use animation, because you can animate all the things, literally, and it will take you all the time, you're probably going to want to go for the low-hanging fruit, that 20% of things that you can animate that will win you 80% better user experience. And the way you do that is you ask yourself if an animation fulfills at least two of these. Does it show causality? Does it give the user feedback? Does it reinforce the location of something on a page or where the user is in a greater information system? Does it show progression? Does it help transition from one state to another? Or does it reinforce physics in some sort of a more physical animation? Like if you're dragging and dropping. I've tried doing that with jump cuts. People like it better when I use physics. So, all right, best practices. This should be the actual title screen. How not to set everything on fire with motion and animation. My poor little laptop's on fire right now. So there's a Shaker saying, and don't make something unless it is both necessary and useful, but if it is both necessary and useful, do not hesitate to make it beautiful, or as I like to say, delightful. What this means is, before you animate anything, just make sure it's really needed, that this animation is really useful. You have to be able to iterate using your words why something deserves to have GPU spent on it, why it deserves an extra ounce of the battery's effort. If you cannot use your words, I know a lot of designers who come in and they get tongue-tied and they'll be like, because it's better, can't you just see that it's better? Use your words, use the words I've been giving you. This is your vocabulary, this is powerful stuff. When I give people a storyboard to justify why something should be animated, it says, here we statefully transition the user from one information space of searching to the information space of the line item that they're looking for. And people get that. People who have money and can pay your team to put effort on things get words. Don't necessarily get gut instincts. Sadly, learned in the field. So, Jacob Nielsen wrote back in 1993, I'm just going to give you a couple of guidelines here so you don't burn your fingers off. Back in 1993, that there are 3 major time limits to keep in mind when optimizing human-computer interactions, specifically page loads. Keep in mind, this is back from, oh my gosh, that magical year in the 90s, 1993. Well, things have changed a little bit since then. As with all research, we love to hand it. I still see people bringing 20-year-old research to the table and saying we should make these decisions based on these 20-year-old research, even though babies are using iPads now. And we can assume that users have changed a little bit in 20 years. We're going to still base a lot of our decisions off this research because nobody else has done any that they've publicly shared with us since. So let's just go with this. That is the caveat for what comes next. These time frames. At 100 milliseconds, a jump cut will feel instantaneous, and a user will not notice a change. They will be like, oh, yay, I am still on the same page, or something like that. An animation is hard to perceive at this speed, by the way. There is this interesting window of perception of change for all humans, exactly between 70 milliseconds and 700 milliseconds. Keep an eye on that range, because it actually lines up with Nielsen's findings pretty well, which is the only reason why I am still repeating them. Page loads from let's see. Now, page loads from 100 millisecond to 1 second, still find it falling into that 70 milliseconds to 700 milliseconds range, will be noticeable, but will not disrupt task flow. This is your sweet spot. When you are animating things, you definitely want it to take longer than 100 milliseconds, but not longer than 1 second. You can do a lot of things with this 1 second time frame. if you need it. Now, at around 10 seconds response delay, users no longer felt like their actions and the interface's reaction were connected. You can think of 10 seconds as the "oh my god, I'm bored, please kill me now" point. Do not animate things for 10 seconds. If it's going to take 10 seconds, consider making a video or putting like a play button on it or something. Here's my site's menu with a 1-second transition duration. Now, when I was working on this, I was like, that looks pretty good. I like that. I'm going to release that into the wild. But no. Funny thing, when you're working with animations and your head's down, and this is totally something that happens to animators in the field as well, actual traditional studio animators, you get pulled into this warped sense of time where things actually seem faster than they really are. And studio animators have come up with a very important rule to get around with, to cope with it, and make sure that they're not releasing really slow motion dancing scenes in feature films. Is it interpretive dance or is that a waltz? We don't know. And that saying is, however long your pre-production animation, have its duration, and then have it again. Basically, that means just run everything at 25% the duration you worked on it. Well, I thought 250 milliseconds was a little fast, so I made it 300 milliseconds. It doesn't have that far a distance to go over, so making it too fast could be a little harmful. And you can see it works. It looks pretty good. It's important to also, quote unquote, eyeball it. Trust your gut. More importantly, trust the users that you're testing on. So in UI animation, you'll see this time and time again coming up, not only in motion design and motion graphics, but you'll find this in game design, this 250 and 300 milliseconds duration. And the reason that keeps happening is because it's right there in the median of that 70 milliseconds to 700 millisecond range that pretty much everyone in the world has for detecting change. It's not too slow that it makes people who can perceive change super fast bored, but it's not so fast that it completely confuses people who, well, old grandpa. And sometimes you're going to need a lot of time. We tend to focus on performance, getting users what they want, getting them the things fast and getting out of their way. But I have seen people try to make animations last 50 milliseconds, which is so fast that it's not even really perceptible to the human mind at all. It just doesn't register. And that is a waste of code. It is a waste of battery life. If it's happening so fast nobody can perceive it, why is it animating at all? So faster is not always better. And deciphering an interface, I mean, while it does increase cognitive load and slow users down just as badly as a slow data connection, if an animation isn't perceived, it can't help decrease that load. Only perceived animations can help decrease a cognitive load. So here's my site's menu with a 100 millisecond duration, which probably isn't even going to register here. Yeah, it's happening so fast. It's you'd blink and you'd miss it. At this point, I might as well just not use animations. Yes. Come back, Grandpa. So older users, this is an interesting fact. Older users tend to experience time much faster than younger users. Everything seems to be happening to them a lot faster. And super speedy jump cuts can be hugely disorienting to them. When in doubt, it's a good idea to test your animations on your real users that fall into your real demographics, not on churl down in sales. So if your site caters to a diverse audience, for instance, you're running a government site or a large retailer site, consider adding a slow down animations option for accessibility settings. Now, lastly, well, not quite lastly, we'll talk more about accessibility in a moment. Animations should be like servers at a fancy restaurant. They get in and they get out of your way. They're like shadows. You don't even notice they're there, but suddenly you have another cocktail. Lovely. If you're testing your animations and people are commenting on them, reconsider the animation. Maybe it could be more subtle. Maybe it moves too much. Maybe it should be a little faster. So it's taking up less of their time. If people notice it enough to comment on it, it means it's not invisible. And if it's not invisible, they could grow tired of it by the third or fourth time. Such animations should be used sparsely. We don't want them to be like this poor creature. A novel delight upon first meeting, but then always hovering and clinging like a relative you'd like to avoid at a family gathering. All right, so there are people in the world who will find motion animations on a website disorienting and possibly even sickening. And for this minority, people who suffer from vestibular disorders, animation can make a site accessible. So here you've done this grand thing to try to make the site more useful to people, and suddenly some people can't use it at all. Isn't that just a kicker, right? Well, even native apps face this problem. For instance, I loved it when iOS 7 brought in this zooming interface because suddenly I could see what app I was using at any given time. I used to not know where any of my apps were on any pages, but then I could zoom into them and I figured it out. But this made people really sick. So iOS 7 introduced the reduce motion option. So let's do this one more time. Notice the zoomage. Zooming makes someone sick. They go to settings. And then under accessibility, I don't think you can do this anymore, but this is genius. And you toggle on reduce motion. What this does is it reduces all the animations that use motion, and it makes them use opacity instead. So they all become fade-ins and fade-outs instead of zooms and zoom-outs. So suddenly the thing that they're showing change is opacity, not location. All right, here we go. We can do this. It's the final four. So how do we, just to refresh your mind, last we were talking about this, we were talking about motion being an issue for folks with vestibular disorders, and oh my gosh, we've gone through so much trouble trying to animate the site so it'll be useful to more people of more ages, and yet we have made it unusable for others. What will we do? Why, cruel world, making a mockery of us? So we have a couple of options here. Number one, we could enable motion by default and offer people a dismissible, disable, or reduce animation option. In the UK, many sites have to do this already for cookies. You've probably seen them if you go to sites like the BBC at all. And it hasn't destroyed design. So I'm going to assume that it wouldn't destroy design. Oh, yeah. Hey, come on, little mouse. It's not going to destroy design if we did something like this for motion. Now, of course, the other option 2, we could ask first. Back in the days of Flash microsites, we learned not to start blasting people with audio. Very important in case the boss is watching. We could also offer in that same dialogue, hey, do you want to experience the site with motion or without motion? And this is the idea that we offer users choice in how they experience the web. Option number 3, for large and task-heavy sites, often they have accessibility settings. This would be where you keep your font options for people who are dyslexic. There are fonts that work for people who have dyslexia, and if you have a big site where people have profiles, it would be nice to be like, here are some fonts in case you haven't figured out how to hack your browser to use those fonts. So if you don't have one of those, but you do have a site that has profiles, you should probably get on that. But you would probably store these in the same accessibility settings. Animation preferences, full animation, reduced animation, or animation off. And yes, you can completely turn animation off using styles and JavaScript. So I don't see a lot of it in the wild. I'm starting to see 1 or 2 examples, but I specifically, when I was working on this project with Mozilla, DevTools Challenger, I gave people the option, because I just wanted to have a decent option, a decent example. I gave people the option to turn off motion, specifically with this little button down here that toggles it. And I thought, oh yeah, so check it out. Oh, come on, go back, do that. So notice at the top, the waves are moving, right? And when you open up this, it slides up and it slides down. But when you turn the animation toggle off, the waves stop moving, and it's a jump cut now. All I'm doing is changing a class There's a animations off class, just sets all animations to off, and all transitions get popped off as well. You could also do the reverse of that, where there's an animation class and removing it just removes all the animations. You'll also notice, but you can't see it on this screen, but when you hover over one of the little tabs down here, there's this really subtle thing that happens where this part does a little subtle motion upward to indicate that if you click on it, it's going to continue moving in that direction. That's a nice little anticipatory causal reaction there. And it actually can help people with mild cases of vestibular disorders anticipate when something's going to start moving. So it's good to put a little bit of an indicator when something is going to start moving on the stage. All right, so in the end, I want to enforce that you want to animate deliberately. You don't want to just throw animation around in the hopes that it will make your system delightful. Use it deliberately or use it not at all. Poorly considered, tacked-on animations will often cause more harm than good. If we cannot afford to slow down and iterate why something should be added into a system, we ought not be messing with it. People do use jump cuts just fine. But just remember the following. Animations are the shortcut through the brain's visual cortex to keep users on their main task. You want to respect people's cone of vision. Remember, color and opacity in the center, keep motion around the peripheral. And find your site's keyframes. You want to find where the different states in your user's journey are, and those are going to be your big wins, connecting them with stateful transitions. And speaking of stateful transitions, remember stateful transitions, supplemental animations, causal effects, and our fats and salts and sugars used sparingly. All right, so if you want to keep up with web animation, I highly recommend signing up for webanimationweekly.com's newsletter. It is a rapidly changing place. There's a web animation API spec that's super awesome, but it's not fully supported in all browsers. There's constantly more information and research being revealed at, like, oh my God, seriously, on a weekly basis. If you want to keep up with it, this and the archives are a great place to start. All right, so thank you all very much for coming out tonight. I ask that you go forth and animate responsibly.